A female alien race forbidden to a human's passion. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Jack Ryder had spent most of his life outrunning trouble, but never had he anticipated being hunted by the vast, unrelenting void of space itself. His ship, a battered but faithful vessel named Valky, was a relic of past wars. Its hull scarred by time and conflict, it had seen its fair share of battles, each dent and scorch mark a testament to the harrowing encounters he had barely survived. But now fate had played its cruelest hand, yet his systems were failing, his thrusters sputtering erratically as he drifted further into the uncharted fringes of the galaxy. The air inside his cockpit was growing thin, the hiss of oxygen reminding him that his luck was about to run out. He had pushed too far too fast into a sector of space that no human was meant to tread. And now he was paying the price. The warning alarms blared in an almost mocking rhythm, a cruel symphony accompanying his descent. His hands were steady on the controls, but his mind raced with the calculations of a doomed man. The gravity well of the unknown planet below had already seized him in its grasp, and his trajectory made it clear he was crashing. There would be no smooth landing, no clever maneuver to pull them free. His ship was going down, and all he could do now was make sure he survived the impact act. He braced himself as the atmosphere ignited around him, flames licking at his viewports like hungry specters. The planet loomed closer, its surface a vast crystalline expanse shimmering beneath the twin suns. Veller, a name whispered through star maps and warnings alike, a place where no human had dared to step and live to tell the tale. The moment Valky struck the surface, Jack felt the violent shudder of metal meeting resistance. His body slammed against harness as the ship tore through the crystalline terrain. The shriek of twisting steel and shattered glass filled his ears, a deafening cacophony of destruction. Sparks flew like miniature explosions inside the cockpit, his vision momentarily blinded by the flickering chaos around him. For a heartbeat, he thought this was it, that he would simply be reduced to another pile of wreckage in a forgotten world. But then silence. The world stopped shaking, and he realized with a gasping breath that he was still alive. Pain laced through his limbs as he unstrapped himself, every muscle protesting as he forced himself to move. The air inside the cabin was thick with smoke, the acrid scent of burning wires making his eyes sting. He had no time to assess the full extent of the damage. The priority now was escaping before something worse happened. His fingers trembled as he activated the emergency hatch, the pressure seals hissing before the door was wrenched open by the force of his push. Cold, crisp air rushed in, replacing the suffocating heat of the ship, and for the first time he took in the alien world outside. Veller was breathtaking in a way that felt unreal. The sky above was a swirling mixture of deep blues and shimmering purples, its atmosphere infused with a strange energy that made the very air hum against his skin. Towering crystalline spires jutted from the ground, glowing faintly with an ethereal light, their surfaces refracting the twin suns in mesmerizing patterns. The ground beneath him was a sleek obsidian-like surface, smooth yet unyielding, stretching endlessly into the horizon. It was beautiful, hauntingly so, but there was no mistaking the danger that lurked beneath its elegance. This was a world that did not welcome outsiders. Jack barely had time to take a step before the sound of approaching movement froze him in place. It was unlike anything he had heard before, a soft melodic hum, as if the very air was whispering in response to unseen presences. His instincts screamed at him to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The crystalline terrain offered no cover, no refuge. And then he saw them. They moved like specters gliding across the ground with an elegance that defied physics, their forms wothed in flowing garments that shimmered like liquid silver. Their faces were obscured by elaborate veils, but even through the translucent fabric he could see the glow of their eyes, luminescent orbs that seemed to pierce through his very being. There was no doubt in his mind. These were the Vori, the enigmatic female race that no human had ever been permitted to see, let alone touch, and at their center stood one unlike the rest. She did not wear a veil. Her skin was white as freshly fallen snow, a stark contrast against the iridescent hues of her surroundings. Her hair long and unbound, cascaded down her back like liquid starlight, moving with an unnatural grace, as if untouched by gravity. But it was her eyes that held him captive, an impossible shade of ice blue glowing with an intensity that made his breath hitch. She was otherworldly, impossibly beautiful, yet there was no warmth in her gaze, only the weight of judgment. Jack had been in dangerous situations before. He had faced bounty hunters, warlords, the harshness of deep space, but nothing compared to the feeling of being scrutinized by this woman. He knew instinctively that she was their leader, that she was their queen, and he also knew that he was very likely about to die. The Velar did not speak his language, yet he understood the meaning in their movements. They surrounded him with a precision that was almost ritualistic, their hands, raised fingers tracing symbols in the air that pulsed with an unseen energy, magic, technology. He couldn't tell which, but it was power, pure and undeniable. Then for the first time she spoke. Her voice was unlike anything he had ever heard. It was a melody, a song woven with meaning beyond the grasp of words, and yet somehow he understood. You should not be here. Jack exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing against him like an invisible force. He had two choices: plead for mercy or meet his fate with defiance. And Jack Ryder had never been one to beg. I didn't exactly plan for this, he said, his voice horror but steady. My ship crashed. I don't want trouble. For a long moment she merely stared at him, as if measuring the truth in his words. Then with a slow, deliberate movement she stepped forward, closer than any of the others dared. Her gaze never wavered as she lifted a single pale hand, reaching toward him as if to test some unspoken boundary. Jack didn't move, didn't breathe. Every fiber of his being screamed that something irreversible was about to happen. And then her fingers brushed against his skin. The universe itself seemed to shatter. A surge of energy, unlike anything he had ever felt, rush through him, white-hot and overwhelming, his vision fracturing into a kaleidoscope of light. His knees buckled, his mind reeling as sensations wet against one another: pleasure, pain, an unbearable pull that resonated deep within his very soul. The Vori around them gasped in shock, their hums turning into sharp, discordant whispers. For a brief, impossible moment, he saw something flicker across the Queen's expression. Not fear, not disgust, something else. Recognition. And then darkness swallowed him whole. Jack awoke to sensation that was neither pain nor comfort, but something in between, a dull, throbbing awareness of his own body, as if he had been submerged in a dense electric fog. His limbs felt weighted, his breath slow and steady but unnaturally controlled, as though something external was guiding the rhythm of his lungs. He blinked, forcing his eyes open against the strange resistance, and the world around him came into hazy focus. He was no longer outside, no longer lying on the cold crystalline ground where the alien Queen's touch had sent his entire existence into a spiraling unknown. Instead, he found himself inside what could only be described as an ethereal prison. The walls were not solid in the way he understood walls to be. They shimmered and pulsed, shifting between translucence and opacity like living glass, the colors within their depths constantly changing, moving as if in response to his very thoughts. There were no visible seams, no doors, no locks, and yet he knew instinctively that he was trapped. The air was thick with an energy that made his skin tingle, a sensation that went beyond mere temperature or atmosphere. It was as if the very space around him was charged with something ancient and powerful, something that recognized his presence and was reacting to it in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. He shifted, testing his muscles, his fingers flexing against the strange surface beneath him, some kind of smooth, polished stone that emitted a faint, almost imperceptible warmth. His head still swam, his body sluggish, but he forced himself to sit up, his mind racing to piece together the fragments of what had happened. The Queen had touched him, that much he remembered with perfect clarity, though the memory of it sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with fear. It had been unlike anything he had ever experienced, a surge of sensation so overwhelming that it had obliterated all rational thought, all sense of self. For a moment it had felt as if his very essence had been unraveled and rewoven, as if something deep within him had awakened to a truth he had never known existed. And then darkness. And now this. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, forcing logic to take hold. He was alive, which meant they hadn't killed him on sight. though that hardly meant he was safe. The Vori were an enigma wrapped in secrecy, their very existence governed by laws that forbade any form of contact with outsiders, yet here he was breathing their air, existing within their domain. And more than that, he had survived their queen's touch. He had seen the way the others had reacted, the way the atmosphere had shifted in that single moment of contact. They had expected him to die, that much was clear, but he hadn't, and that meant something dangerous, something they had not prepared for. A sound, soft yet resonant, filled the space around him, and he turned his head sharply, his instincts already on edge. The walls of his strange confinement shimmered again, parting like liquid glass to reveal a figure standing just beyond their threshold. She moved with a grace that was almost unnatural, her steps soundless against the polished floor, her presence both commanding and effortless. It was her, the Queen. Jack exhaled slowly, watching as she entered without a word, the walls sealing seamlessly behind her. Up close, she was even more striking, her presence almost impossible to process. Her skin, that haunting shade of white, seemed to glow in the dim light, her features perfectly sculpted in a way that was both familiar and utterly alien. Her eyes, those piercing ice-blue irises, studied him with an intensity that sent a strange heat through his veins, though her expression remained unreadable. She wore no crown, no embellishments of power, yet there was no mistaking who she was. Every movement, every breath she took radiated authority, the weight of her station woven into the very fabric of her being. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them stretched heavy with unspoken questions, with the tension of two beings who should not have been able to exist in the same space, and yet had been thrust together by forces neither could fully understand. Then finally she tilted her head, her gaze narrowing ever so slightly, as if studying some rare and perplexing specimen. "You are conscious," she said at last, her voice smooth as flowing water, carrying an accent that was both melodic and sharp, each syllable shaped by a language not meant for human tongues. And yet he understood her perfectly. The realization sent a ripple of unease through him, but he masked it, keeping his expression neutral. "Yeah," he said, his own voice rough in comparison, his throat still dry from whatever had been done to him. "Not sure if I should be thanking you or questioning how I'm still alive." Her lips parted slightly, not quite a smile, but something close to amusement flickered across her otherwise impassive face. "You should not be," she said, "simply alive, that is." Jack arched a brow. "Well, that's comforting." She ignored his remark, her gaze drifting over him, as if searching for something unseen. "No human has ever survived direct contact with one of my kind," she continued, as if speaking more to herself than to him. "Our energies are not meant to mix. It is forbidden for a reason." He exhaled through his nose, leaning back against the smooth surface behind him, his mind racing. "I keep hearing that word, forbidden, but I'm starting to think that doesn't mean what it used to." At that, something shifted in her expression, a flicker of something he couldn't name, something guarded, perhaps even conflicted. "You do not understand the weight of what has happened," she said, and for the first time he detected something beneath the surface of her voice, something that sounded almost like uncertainty. "This was not supposed to be possible." Jack held her gaze, refusing to look away, "and yet here I am." Silence stretched between them again, but this time it was different. There was no hostility in it, no immediate threat of violence. It was the silence of two people standing on the precipice of something unknown, something vast and dangerous and irrevocable. He could feel it in the air, in the way the very energy of the room seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. He was not supposed to be here, and yet he was, and whatever had happened between them, whatever had caused him to survive, had shattered something far greater than just an ancient law. She took a slow step closer, her movements measured, deliberate. "Tell me, human," she said, her voice softer now, though no less commanding. "What are you?" Jack let out a slow breath, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Despite the weight of the moment, "Funny," he murmured. "I was just about to ask you the same thing." For the first time, her expression truly changed, and in that moment Jack knew whatever he had become in her eyes, he was no longer just an outsider. He was something far more dangerous. He was a question that had no answer. Jack could feel the weight of her stare pressing down on him, her gaze sharp and unwavering, as if she was peeling back the layers of his existence to see what lay beneath. The air in the chamber seemed heavier now, charged with something unseen yet palpable, an invisible force crackling between them. Like static before a storm, he was still trying to process the gravity of what she had said, the implications settling over him like a suffocating fog. No human had ever survived direct contact with her kind, not one that meant either something about him was different, something he had never known about himself, or there was something about her that she was not willing to admit. Neither answer reassured him. He was trapped in a world that should have been his tomb, standing before a queen who should have been his executioner, and yet neither had happened. Instead, she had let him live. That more than anything unsettled him. She took another step closer, the soft material of her robe flowing around her like liquid silver, barely making a sound as she moved. The energy around her was different from the others, stronger, more refined, as if it were an extension of herself rather than something she simply wielded. Jack could feel it brushing against his skin, a tingling sensation that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. It was unlike anything he had encountered before, a power that felt ancient and yet familiar. He didn't know why, but something in his bones told him that he had felt this before, somewhere, somehow. But that was impossible. He had never been here, never encountered the Viller before, never known of their existence beyond the distant warnings that echoed through human space, and yet his body recognized something. His mind could not. You should not exist, she murmured almost to herself as she lifted a hand, her fingers hovering just inches from his face. She did not touch him again, but he could feel the heat of her presence, the slow pulse of energy radiating from her skin. There is nothing in the universe that accounts for this, Jack exhaled, keeping himself still, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to move, to put space between them, before he found himself ensnared in something he did not understand. But he didn't move. He couldn't, because no matter how much danger she represented, no matter how precarious his situation was, there was a part of him, deep buried, ancient, that was drawn to her in a way that defied logic. Not sure what you want me to say, he muttered, voice rougher than he intended at his throat, still raw from whatever had been done to him while he was unconscious. I'm just a man who had a really bad day and ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something closer to curiosity, as if she was weighing his words against something unseen. No, she said simply, tilting her head in that unnervingly graceful way of hers. You are not just a man. If you were, you would be dead. Jack clenched his jaw, his pulse hammering against his ribs. She wasn't wrong. He should have been dead. He had seen the way the others had reacted when she had touched him, the sheer disbelief, the fear masked beneath their stoic expressions. They had expected him to dissolve into nothingness, to be ripped apart by whatever force governed their existence. But that hadn't happened. Instead, he had remained standing, and whatever had passed between them in that moment had been enough to shake even their queen. So what does that mean, he asked, forcing his voice to remain even controlled. What does that make me? For the first time something flickered across her expression, uncertainty. It was fleeting, gone in an instant, but he had seen it. Whatever she had expected, she did not have an answer, and that more than anything sent a chill down his spine. Because if she, the ruler of this strange and powerful race, did not know what he was, then that meant no one did before. She could respond. The walls around them shimmered once more, the same fluid movement, parting to reveal another figure standing in the threshold. This one was different. Her robes darker, her features sharper, her gaze filled with something dangerously close to hostility. Jack didn't need to understand their language to know that this one did not trust him, that she did not approve of whatever strange curiosity her queen had taken in him. The newcomer spoke, her voice urgent, clipped. Though Jack could not understand the words, the queen turned slightly, her attention shifting just enough to acknowledge the intrusion without completely severing the invisible thread that still bound her. Focused to him, a brief exchange followed, their voices low but intense, the melodic flow of their language masking the tension that simmered beneath it. Jack watched closely, nodding the way the queen's expression remained calm, composed, while the other woman's movements were sharper, edged with something he could only describe as warning. Then the queen turned back to him, her gaze assessing. You are to be Brought before the elders, she said, her voice carrying a weight that made it clear this was not a choice. They will decide what is to be done with you. Jack exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as he let that sink, and he didn't know who the elders were, but he could guess: rulers, judges, the ones who made the laws that govern this place, the ones who had deemed humans untouchable, forbidden, if they were the ones making the decisions. Then his chances of walking away from this alley were rapidly dwindling. "And what do you think they're going to decide?" he asked, leveling her with a look. "Because I'm guessing let the human go free isn't on the list of options." She didn't answer immediately, and that more than anything was telling. "You should not be here," she said again, quieter this time, though the meaning behind it had shifted. "And yet you are." Jack let out a short breath of dry laughter, shaking his head. "Yeah, I've been getting that a lot." She studied him for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, something he couldn't name but could feel settling in his bones. Then, with the slightest incline of her head, she turned, motioning for the guards, if that's what they were to step forward. Jack didn't resist as they closed in around him, their movements precise, efficient. There was no need for force. He knew that for now the best thing he could do was go along with whatever this was, to wait and watch and figure out what the hell was happening, because there was something here, something deeper than just ancient laws and forbidden contact. He could feel it as they led him from the chamber. The Queen's voice followed him, soft yet unyielding. "The universe does not make mistakes," she said, "but you are an anomaly." Jack didn't look back as he was led into the unknown, but he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened next, nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Jack walked with measured steps, his mind racing as he was escorted through the alien corridors by the silent, imposing guards. Their movements were eerily synchronized, each step falling into rhythm with the other, their robes barely shifting as they moved. It was like walking with ghosts, their presence more felt than heard, their expressions locked into unreadable masks. The walls around him shimmered with that same living light, pooling softly like a heartbeat, casting strange shadows that moved even when no one did. The air was thick with an unspoken tension and energy that pressed against his skin, crawling beneath it like a current waiting to be unleashed. He could feel their eyes on him, though none of them spoke, none of them acknowledged him beyond the necessity of their duty. He was an outsider, a trespasser in a world that was never meant to accommodate his kind. And yet here he was, breathing their air, walking their sacred halls, bound for judgment before beings who had already decided long before he ever arrived that he should not exist. His thoughts kept circling back to the Queen Xena. He hadn't heard her name spoken, but he knew it. He felt it as if it had always been buried somewhere in his mind, waiting for the right moment to surface. That alone should have been impossible. The Velir were a mystery, a legend wrapped in cosmic warnings and unbreakable laws. No human had ever seen them and lived, and yet when she had touched him, something had happened, something neither of them understood, something that had left her staring at him with a mixture of confusion and something else he couldn't quite define. He could still feel the ghost of that touch against his skin, the way his body had reacted, not with pain, but with a surge of something ancient and raw. He had looked into her eyes and seen the same uncertainty reflected back at him, and yet despite that moment, despite the fact that she had clearly been shaken, she had not fought for him. She had not defended him when the others demanded that he be judged. Whatever curiosity she felt, whatever strange connection had formed between them, it was not enough to change the course of what was coming. He would stand before the elders, before the architects of Velir law, and his fate would be decided by beings who viewed him as a violation of their very existence. His survival of her touch had not been a miracle, it had been a disruption, an anomaly that they would seek to correct, and Jack had no illusions about what that correction would entail. The core ended in a massive archway that looked as if it had been carved from pure crystal, its surface shifting between transparency and opaque Andis, like a portal into another realm. Beyond it, a vast chamber stretched outward, the ceiling so high it vanished into the soft glow of the structures above. The walls pulsed with the same living energy he had seen throughout the city, though here it was more controlled, more refined, as if the very essence of this place was woven into the foundation of Velir power. A series of elevated platforms formed a half circle At the center, their bases appearing to hover just above the ground, held aloft by forces Jack could not begin to understand, and upon them sat the elders. They were not what he expected. He had imagined beings of great age, their bodies withered by time, but what he saw instead were figures that looked untouched by years, their forms as smooth and regal as statues carved from celestial marble. They radiated an authority that was not merely granted but innate, their presence alone enough to command obedience without words. Their robes were different from the others he had seen, woven with intricate patterns that seemed to move on their own, shifting and rearranging as they watched him approach. Their eyes, though similar to Xena in their luminous glow, were colder, more detached, as if they saw not a man but a disturbance in the fabric of their existence. Jack forced himself to keep his posture, relaxed, his hands at his sides, not clenched, not defensive. He had stood before warlords, before corrupt officials, and bounty hunters who had all seen him as a problem that needed solving. He had survived them. He would survive this, or he'd die trying. One of the elders, a figure seated at the highest point of the platform, raised a hand, and immediately the chamber was silent. When they spoke, their voice was not loud, but it carried, threading through the very air itself, vibrating against Jack's skin like a sound that was not meant to be heard by mortal ears. "You are the human," the elder said, though it was not phrased as a question. It was a statement of fact delivered with the weight of judgment already past. Jack exhaled through his nose, resisting the urge to smirk. "That's what they tell me," he said, his voice deliberately steady. He would not give them the satisfaction of fear. The elder's eyes narrowed slightly, though there was no visible light change in their expression beyond that. "You should not be here," they continued, repeating the same words he had heard from Xena, though this time they were spoken with finality, not uncertainty. "You are an aberration, a disruption to the natural order." Jack tilted his head slightly. "Funny. I don't remember signing up for that." A murmur rippled through the chamber, quiet but noticeable, a reaction to his tone, his defiance. He could feel the tension in the air, thick, a coil winding tighter with every breath. "You misunderstand the gravity of your presence here," another elder spoke, their voice softer but no less firm. "You have crossed a boundary that was never meant to be broken. The existence of your kind and ours has been kept separate for a reason." Jack met their gaze without wavering. "And what reason is that?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough edge to challenge, without outright provoking. "Because from where I'm standing your laws aren't exactly holding up well. I touched your queen, and I didn't drop dead. So maybe you should be asking why." A sharper murmur spread through the chamber at that, the implication of his words striking deeper than the first. The air itself seemed to pulse in reaction, as if the very walls were alive with the conversation. Jack didn't know if it was reckless or necessary to push, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to beg. If he was going to die, he'd rather go out asking the questions no one wanted answered. One of the elders, the only one who had not yet spoken, leaned forward slightly, their gaze colder than the others. "The laws of our people were set long before your species reached the stars. They are not yours to question." Jack held their gaze unflinching, "and yet here I am." Silence, long stretched silence. Then, for the first time since he had entered, another voice filled the chamber, soft, controlled, but undeniably firm. "Enough, Xena." Jack turned his head as she stepped forward, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, but her presence undeniable. The guards did not stop her. The elders did not rebuke her, and in that moment something shifted in the air, something unseen but powerful. Jack didn't know what she was going to say, but whatever it was about to change everything. The chamber fell into an unnatural stillness the moment Xena's voice rang out, though she had spoken softly, that there was no mistaking the command in her tone. It was not the sharp authority of a ruler exerting dominance over her subordinates, nor was it the voice of someone pleading for leniency. It was something else entirely, something that carried weight without force, something that demanded attention simply by existing. The elders, so regal and unmovable, shifted ever so slightly in their seats, their luminous eyes turning toward their queen with an expression that bordered on curiosity and displeasure in equal measure. She had interrupted them. That alone was significant. Jack watched her closely, his instinct screaming at him to stay silent, to let her play whatever hand she was about to reveal. This was her world, her stage, and he was nothing more than an anomaly thrown into the middle of a carefully maintained order. If he had learned anything about surviving, it was that sometimes the best move was simply to watch and wait. But that didn't mean he wasn't burning with questions, didn't mean his skin wasn't still humming with the residual energy of whatever had passed between them. Xena stepped forward. With measured grace, each step an act of precision, as if she were navigating an invisible battlefield, where the slightest misstep could spell disaster. When she finally came to a halt, she turned to face the elders fully. Her chin lifted, her expression unreadable. Jack could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands remained still at her sides, as though she were forcing herself to remain composed. The laws that govern our people, she began, her voice steady, are absolute. In their authority, they have kept us safe, they have preserved our existence, they have ensured that our way of life remains untouched by the chaos of the wider universe. Jack narrowed his eyes slightly. There was something deliberate in the way she spoke, something that felt rehearsed, but not dishonest. It was the way a soldier might recite doctrine, while secretly questioning its meaning. The highest elder, the one who had spoken, first regarded her with that same detached scrutiny. And yet they said, "You stand before us now speaking for the human. Are we to assume this is an act of defiance?" The words carried a quiet threat beneath them, a warning wrapped in diplomatic neutrality. Xena did not falter. "No," she said simply, "it is an act of necessity." A murmur swept through the chain chamber, a ripple of energy that Jack could almost feel against his skin. The elders did not often find themselves challenged, and certainly not by one of their own. He had seen it before in different places, different systems, powerful rulers who had grown so accustomed to their word being law that even the hint of resistance felt like a threat to their very existence. One of the elders, the one who had looked at Jack with the most disdain, leaned forward slightly. "Explain." Xena inclined her head. "The human should not have survived my touch," she said, her voice even control. "That is undeniable. It is also undeniable that he did. What transpired between us defies the laws we have always believed to be unbreakable, and if a law is broken it must be examined." Jack exhaled slowly. Smart. She wasn't fighting them outright. She wasn't defending him out of some reckless sense of defiance. She was positioning this as a question, as an issue that needed to be studied rather than destroyed. It was a tactical move, and it might just be the only thing keeping him from immediate execution. One of the elders regarded her with a slow, deliberate gaze. "Are you suggesting," they said, "that our knowledge is incomplete?" There it was, the true heart of the issue. This wasn't just about Jack. It was about the very foundation of the Vel's belief system. If he was an exception, then that meant the laws they had upheld for centuries, perhaps even longer, were flawed. And for beings who had built their entire way of life around those laws, the idea of being wrong was more dangerous than any outsider could ever be. Xena did not answer immediately. Instead, she let the weight of the question settle over the chamber, let the silence stretch just long enough to force the elders to confront it themselves. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured. "I am suggesting that an anomaly has occurred. An anomaly, by their nature, demand further understanding." Jack nearly smirked. She was good. The elders exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable, but not dismissive. They were considering it. That alone was a victory. Then the highest elder turned their gaze back to Jack. "Human," they said, their tone making it clear they addressed him only because it was necessary, not because they wished to. "You claim to have no knowledge of why you survived." Jack met their gaze without hesitation. "That's right." A pause. "Then, and yet you do not fear it." Jack exhaled through his nose. "Fear doesn't change facts," he said. "I don't know why I survived, neither do you. That's why we're all standing here." The elder studied him for a long moment, then slowly they shifted their gaze back to Xena. "And what would you have us do?" Xena remained utterly composed. "He should be studied, observed until we understand the nature of this anomaly. We cannot act in ignorance." Jack had to give her credit. She wasn't giving them much room to argue. She wasn't fighting for his freedom. She wasn't pushing for anything that could be seen as reckless. She was making it about knowledge, about their own need to understand. And in doing so, she had given them something they could not easily dismiss. The elders exchanged Another glance, then the highest one nodded once. Very well. They said the human will remain under your custody. You are responsible for him. Jack barely managed to keep his expression neutral. That was unexpected. Xena, however, simply inclined her head in acceptance. I understand. The highest elder's gaze darkened slightly. See that you do. And just like that, the judgment was rendered. The chamber began to shift, the glowing walls pulling in time with some unseen force as the elders slowly retreated their platform, forms carrying them upward into the vast reaches of the space above. The moment they were gone, the tension in the air loosened just slightly, like an invisible weight had been lifted. Jack exhaled, turning to Xena. That went well, he muttered. She gave him a look, one that carried a warning. You are not safe. She said you are only valuable for as long as they believe you may hold answers. The moment you cease to be useful. Jack nodded slowly. Yeah, I got that part. She studied him for a long moment, something unreadable in her gaze. Then without another word she turned, motioning for him to follow. Jack did, because whatever had just happened in that chamber, one thing was certain: his time on Velar was far from over. Jack followed Xena through the labyrinthine corridors of the Velar stronghold, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and instincts. The tension from the chamber of the elders still clung to him like a second skin, the weight of their judgment pressing down on his every step. He had expected death, had braced himself for it, but instead he had been granted something far more precarious: an uncertain existence, a temporary reprieve under the guardianship of a queen who herself seemed to be standing on shifting ground. He wasn't foolish enough to mistake it for freedom. No, this was something else entirely. He was a specimen now, a subject of study, a question that demanded an answer, and the moment that answer failed to satisfy them, the moment they decided he was more risk than revelation, he knew exactly how quickly that reprieve would end. But what unsettled him more than anything wasn't the elders or their cold deliberation. It was Xena. She had spoken for him, had intervened when she had no reason to. She could have easily allowed them to condemn him, to rid themselves of the uncertainty he represented. Instead, she had chosen to fight subtly, strategically, but undeniably, and the way she had looked at him, the way she had measured his every word, every movement, made it clear that whatever curiosity had taken root in her mind, it wasn't fatting. If anything, it was growing. The silence between them was thick as they walked, neither speaking, both lost in their own thoughts. Jack's footsteps echoed against the crystalline